What would you do if you were in the same circumstances with the characters in the following stories? We would very love to know, and you could share it below under the comment sections. Now, let the stories unfold.
The 8-year-old boy stood outside the most luxurious restaurant in Chicago. The toddler he protected as his own brother, Micah, barely 18 months old, was strapped against his chest. Micah was the son of Rachel's late friend, and Rachel had taken him in before she fell ill. But to Jonah, he was the only family he had left to protect. In his hand, he held a photograph of a woman lying in a hospital bed, dying. This was the 15th night he had been begging for money. Inside the restaurant, wealthy people lifted their glasses in quiet celebration. Outside, the boy stood trembling in the bitter wind, waiting for anyone willing to stop. Then the door opened. A man stepped out. Black suit, broad shoulders, a face as cold and unyielding as stone. The whole city knew the name Sterling, and they feared the power behind it. But Ashton Sterling was a ghost, a man who ruled from the shadows and rarely let the world see his face. But the moment his eyes fell on the photograph in the boy's hand, his phone slipped from his fingers. It struck the pavement. He didn't bend down to pick it up. He only stood there, staring at the woman's face in the picture. Thin, pale, eyes half closed. But it was still her. The only woman he had ever truly loved, staring back at him from a faded piece of paper. "Where did you get this photograph?" His voice was no longer cold. It trembled. It broke, as though someone had just driven a knife straight through his chest. The boy didn't understand what was happening. He didn't understand why the most powerful man in the city was looking at him that way. He only knew one thing. "That's my mother. My mother is dying, and I need money to save her." The man closed his eyes. His jaw tightened. His hands slowly curled into fists. His whole body trembled once. 8 years. 8 years ago, he had lost the woman in that photograph. He had searched for her everywhere. He had believed she was gone forever. But now, as he looked into the boy's eyes, gray-blue and exactly like his own, something inside him shattered. If you want to know what happens next, hit that like button and share this video right now. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our best stories each week. And now, let us turn back time to the first night when it all began. 15 days before that fateful night, Jonah Mercer sat on the floor of a basement apartment in Chicago's South Side. The room was so small it could barely hold a single bed, an old gas stove, and a wooden table with paint peeling from its surface. Damp walls were stained with blotches of yellow watermarks. The window sat level with the ground, low enough to show nothing but the feet of passing strangers moving along the sidewalk above. The light that slipped into the room was so weak it felt as though even the sun was reluctant to witness the life unfolding inside. On the bed, the thin blanket still held the same folded shape it had carried for 4 days. Ever since his mother had been rushed to the emergency room, Jonah hadn't dared touch it. He was afraid that if he disturbed the last trace of his mother's scent lingering on the pillow, he would forget what it felt like to be held in her arms. Micah was crying in the old crib, only 18 months old. He wasn't Jonah's blood brother, but the son of a dear friend and neighbor who had passed away. Rachel had taken the boy in without hesitation, and now, Jonah cared for him as if they shared the same DNA. He still couldn't say much, but his cries were a language Jonah understood more clearly than any words in the world. This cry meant hunger. Jonah rose, lifted his brother into his arms, and checked his diaper. Wet. He changed it with movements that had long since become second nature. 8 years old, and Jonah already knew how to mix formula at the right temperature, how to pat his brother's back until he burped, how to rock him to sleep with the lullaby their mother used to sing. These weren't things meant for an 8-year-old child, but Jonah didn't have any other choice. After Micah had finished drinking, Jonah laid him down on the bed and placed pillows around him so he wouldn't roll off. Then he walked to the corner of the room, where an old tin box sat, the same box his mother always used to keep money in. He lifted the lid. Inside were a few crumpled bills and some coins. He counted them, $89. Jonah looked over at the paper on the table. The hospital bill, $47,000. He wasn't good at math, but he knew the distance between 89 and 47,000 was a bottomless abyss. That night, Jonah didn't sleep. He sat there watching Micah's breathing rise and fall, staring at the empty bed, staring at the photograph of his mother on the nightstand. In that picture, she was smiling. That smile was gone now, replaced by the pale face on the hospital bed, the one he had captured with his mother's old phone and printed out. He made his decision. He had to do something. On the first day, Jonah strapped Micah to his chest and stood outside St. Patrick Church after Sunday Mass. He held his mother's picture at chest level and said nothing. People looked at him, looked at the baby, looked at the photograph. A few stopped to ask questions. He told them about his mother. They gave him a few dollars and kept walking. After 3 days outside the church, Jonah had made another $23. From the 4th day to the 7th, he moved to the front of a Walmart. Security guards chased him away. The first time, he left and then came back. The second time, they threatened to call the police. The third time, an older guard looked at him with eyes full of both anger and pity and told him to go, not to make him do something he didn't want to do. 4 days at Walmart earned Jonah $8. From the 8th day to the 12th, he stood at a Shell gas station near the highway. People were in more of a hurry there, but every now and then, someone still stopped. One middle-aged woman gave him $30 and a can of formula for Micah. She didn't ask a single question. She just looked at him for a long moment, then got back into her car and drove away. On the 13th and 14th days, Jonah went to the corner of Michigan Avenue, where luxury stores glowed with light and expensive cars glided past. He thought people were richer there, and maybe they would give more. But rich people walked faster. They didn't look down. 2 days, $15. One evening at the gas station, Micah cried without stopping. The little boy was hungry, but the formula had run out by noon, and Jonah still hadn't made enough money to buy another can. Jonah looked down at the packet of crackers in his pocket, his only dinner. He broke the crackers into small pieces, dipped them in water until they softened, and fed them to his brother. Micah stopped crying. Jonah didn't eat anything that night. Once, while standing on the corner, a woman in an expensive coat stopped and looked at him. In a voice filled with both concern and suspicion, she asked, "Where are your parents?" Jonah didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. Should he tell her that his father had never existed in his life? Should he tell her that his mother was lying in a hospital bed and might never leave it? He only stood there in silence, staring at the ground, until the woman sighed and walked away. On the 14th night, Jonah sat at the corner of Michigan Avenue with his back against the wall of a closed store. Micah slept against his chest, his warm breath brushing Jonah's neck. Jonah counted the money in his pocket again. $165. He had walked dozens of miles. He had stood for hundreds of hours. He had watched thousands of people pass him by, and he had $165. He was still short $46,835. Jonah pulled Micah closer against him. His body was exhausted. His legs ached. His eyes felt heavy with sleeplessness. But he didn't cry. He had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. He only leaned close and whispered into his brother's ear, his voice trembling in the cold wind. "Micah, I don't know what to do anymore." 5 days earlier, in a room at St. Mary Hospital, Jonah sat on a hard plastic chair beside his mother's bed. Micah was asleep in his lap, his head resting against his brother's chest, his tiny hand clutching a fold of Jonah's shirt, as though he were afraid of being abandoned, even in his dreams. The clock on the wall read 2 o'clock in the morning. The room was silent except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the heavy sound of Rachel's breathing. His mother lay trapped in a feverish sleep, her voice a mere whisper of the woman she used to be. Her eyes were shut, but her eyelids kept fluttering over and over. Then she began to speak. Not to Jonah. She was speaking through delirium, her voice hoarse, as though her throat had been scraped raw with sandpaper. "Blackwood, he owes me 8 years. Jonah leaned closer. "Mom, what are you saying?" But Rachel didn't answer. Her lips kept moving, repeating that name again and again. Blackwood, Blackwood. Then she sank back into sleep, leaving Jonah alone with a name he didn't understand. Jonah didn't know then that Blackwood was the massive business empire ruled by Ashton Sterling. To a boy from the South Side, it was just a name whispered in his mother's fevered dreams. A puzzle he wasn't yet meant to solve. He didn't know what his mother was talking about, but he remembered it, because anything that stayed in her mind, even while she drifted in fever and confusion, had to matter. Now, 10 days after that night, Jonah was sitting on a corner along Michigan Avenue, his back pressed against the cold wall behind him. It was 9 o'clock at night. People were still moving along the street, but not one of them looked down at where he sat. Micah was asleep against his chest, breathing softly and evenly. A shadow moved toward him. The man was around 50, with an unkempt beard and a jacket torn at the shoulder. He sat down beside Jonah, leaving just enough space not to feel threatening. "Hey, kid. I've seen you here for days. You're not street people." Jonah said nothing. He only tightened his arms around Micah. "Your mom?" The man jerked his chin toward the photograph in Jonah's hand. "You need money?" Jonah nodded. The man sighed and scratched at his beard. "Listen, kid. Standing outside churches, supermarkets, gas stations, it's useless. People toss you a few dollars and forget you the next second. You want real money? You need to go where the really rich people are." "Where?" "Downtown. There's a restaurant called Blackwoods on Rush Street. Real fancy place. The people coming out of there are drunk, dressed in expensive clothes. They throw money around. One time, some guy gave me a whole $100 just because he was in a good mood." Jonah froze. His whole body went still, as if he had suddenly turned to ice. Blackwoods. That name. It was the same name his mother had murmured in her fevered sleep. His heart began to pound faster. He didn't understand why. He didn't understand what the connection was, but something inside him pulled tight, as though an invisible thread had wrapped itself around his chest and was drawing him toward that name. "Where is Blackwoods?" he asked. The man gave him directions. "Rush Street. Go straight down Michigan, then turn right. You'll see it. The restaurant has black glass windows and a brass letter B on the door." Jonah stood, adjusting the strap that held Micah against his chest. Then he looked at the man. "Thank you." The man waved a hand. "Be careful, kid. That area's full of all kinds of people late at night." Jonah nodded and started walking away. In his mind, there was only one thing: Rush Street, Blackwoods. He didn't know that fate was drawing him toward the exact place he needed to be. He didn't know that the man he was about to meet there was the very man his mother had spoken of in her delirium. He only knew that he had to try. For his mother. For Micah. Because he had no other choice left. The man held out his hand. "Get in the car. I'll take you to your mother." Jonah didn't move. The instinct of a child who had spent 15 days surviving on the streets made his whole body lock in place. He had been taught never to get into a stranger's car. He had heard the stories about children who disappeared and were never seen again. But this man knew his mother. Jonah could see that in his eyes, in the way he had stared at the photograph, in the way his voice had trembled when he asked about her. Those weren't the eyes of a con man. They were the eyes of someone who had just seen a ghost rise out of his past. Micah stirred against Jonah's chest, letting out a small whimper from the cold. Jonah looked down at his brother, then he looked back at the man. He had no choice. He climbed into the car. Inside the Bentley, everything felt foreign to Jonah. The leather seats were soft, smooth, and black as polished stone. The scent of a new car mingled with the smell of expensive cologne. Warm air drifted gently from the heater and brushed against his face. Jonah sat, curled into the corner of the back seat, not daring to lean back, as though he were afraid his filthy clothes might stain the costly leather. Micah was still asleep, his small head resting against Jonah's chest, his mouth slightly open in peaceful exhaustion. Ashton watched them from the other side of the seat, his eyes never leaving the two boys, though he didn't dare move closer. Jonah didn't know that his life had just turned in an entirely different direction. The man sat beside Jonah and said nothing. He stared out through the window, his jaw clenched, one hand resting on his thigh, curled into a fist. In the front seat, another man was driving. He was older, with salt and pepper hair, broad shoulders, and a gold chain around his neck. He glanced into the rearview mirror, studying the boy in the back with an expression that carried both curiosity and caution. Ray had been with Ashton Sterling for 18 years. He had seen his boss face every kind of situation imaginable. Tense negotiations, betrayal, deadly threats. Never once had he seen Ashton lose his composure. Never once had he seen his hands shake. But tonight, when Ray looked into the mirror, he saw something he had never seen before. Ashton's hand was trembling. Only slightly, almost too faint to notice. But Ray noticed. 18 years beside a man was long enough to recognize even the smallest changes in his body. Who is this kid? Ray wondered. Who is he? That Ashton Sterling, the man this whole city feared, would become like this because of him. Silence stretched through the car. Then Ashton spoke, his voice low and rough. "How long has your mother been in the hospital?" 19 days, Jonah answered, his voice small but clear. "And you've been on your own all that time?" Jonah didn't answer. He only pulled Micah tighter against him, as though that was the only answer he had to give. Ashton turned and looked at the boy. Really looked at him. The child was so thin, his shoulder bones pushed against the fabric of his torn hoodie. Dark circles shadowed his eyes from too many sleepless nights. His hands were roughened from standing out in the cold day after day. But he was still holding his little brother close, still keeping him safe, still refusing to let go. Ashton remembered himself at 8 years old. He had been thin like that too. He had known what it meant to fend for himself when the adults in his life could no longer be trusted. But he hadn't had anyone to protect. This boy did. He had a baby brother, and he had done everything he could to keep that child safe. Ray glanced into the mirror once more. He saw Ashton looking at the boy with something in his eyes he couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't curiosity. It was something deeper than that, more painful than that, as though Ashton were staring at a piece of himself he had lost long ago. The car turned into the drive leading to St. Mary Hospital. Light from the main building spilled across the parking lot in a pale glow. Ray pulled the car to a stop in front of the main entrance. Ashton opened the door and got out immediately, not waiting for anyone. He strode toward the hospital doors with long, decisive steps. Ray watched him go, then turned to Jonah. "Follow him, kid." Jonah lifted Micah and climbed out of the car. He didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know who this man was to his mother. He only knew that for the first time in 15 days, someone was helping him, and he would follow that man all the way until he could bring his mother home. Near midnight, the hallways of St. Mary Hospital lay hushed and nearly empty. The cold white glow of fluorescent lights spilled across the polished tile floor, throwing back the reflections of 3 figures moving down the corridor. Jonah led the way, with Micah still asleep against his chest. Ashton walked just behind him, his stride long and purposeful. Ray followed last, his eyes sweeping the surroundings with the instinct of a man long used to protecting others. A nurse sitting at the station looked up at the sound of approaching footsteps. She recognized Jonah at once. "You again? It's almost midnight, kid. Visiting hours ended a long time ago." Jonah opened his mouth, ready to explain, but Ashton stepped forward before he could say a word. He didn't look at the nurse. He looked straight toward the reception desk at the end of the hallway and walked directly to it. The night receptionist, a middle-aged woman wearing glasses, raised her head with a tired expression. "The hospital isn't admitting new patients at this hour, sir." "I'm not here to be admitted," Ashton said, his voice low and cold. "I need to speak to the administrator, right now." The woman blinked and leaned back slightly, unsettled by the authority radiating from the man standing in front of her. "Sir, the administrator isn't working at this hour." "Then call him here." Ashton placed a black card on the counter. "Tell him Ashton Sterling needs to speak with him." That name landed like an electric shock. The woman looked down at the card, then back up at Ashton's face, her eyes widening. She picked up the phone at once. 15 minutes later, the hospital administrator appeared, a middle-aged man in a suit, moving quickly, his hair still slightly disheveled, as though he had just been pulled from sleep. "Mr. Sterling, this is an unexpected honor. How may I help you?" Ashton didn't waste a second. "Patient Rachel Mercer. What room is she in?" The administrator glanced at the computer screen the receptionist had already pulled up. "Room 312, sir, but visiting hours. I want to pay her entire bill. Right now." Silence followed. The administrator blinked. "Her entire bill?" "Yes. And I want her moved to a VIP room. The best doctor. The best everything this hospital has to offer. Cost is not an issue." The administrator stared at Ashton for a long moment, as if trying to make certain he hadn't misheard. Then he nodded and signaled for the receptionist to pull up the balance. When the number appeared on the screen, the receptionist drew in a sharp breath. $47,000, sir." Ashton didn't even blink. He took out his wallet and set a black credit card on the counter. "Is that done?" Jonah stood a few steps behind, staring at the whole scene as though his eyes could no longer trust what they were seeing. $47,000. The amount he had spent 15 days trying to gather. The amount he had believed he would never, ever reach. This man paid it in less than a minute, without a trace of hesitation. After the paperwork was completed, Jonah led Ashton to room 312. They moved through long corridors, turning one corner after another, until they stopped outside a room with a glass door. Inside, Rachel was asleep. The heart monitor sounded in its steady rhythm. The dim light in the room touched her face, pale and gaunt. Ashton stopped before the glass. He didn't go in. He only stood there, looking through it. Rachel was far thinner than she had been 8 years earlier. Her cheekbones stood out sharply. Her eyes were sunken deep. Brown hair spilled across the white pillow, stripped now of the healthy shine he remembered. But it was still her. Still, that same woman. The woman he had searched for everywhere. The woman he had believed was gone from his life forever. Ashton lifted his hand and placed his palm against the glass. Cold. Only a thin sheet of glass separated him from her. Yet he didn't dare step inside. He didn't know what right he had to cross that threshold. Ray stood behind him, watching in silence. In 18 years, he had seen Ashton do many things, but he had never once seen Ashton stand before a door and not dare walk through it. Jonah looked at the man, then at his mother inside the room, then back at the man again. His voice was small, but clear. "You know my mother, don't you?" Ashton didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. His hand remained pressed to the glass. His eyes never left Rachel. And Jonah understood. That look had already said everything. Ashton turned to Ray. "I'm staying here. Go handle the rest." Ray studied Ashton for a moment, then gave a single nod. "Yes, boss." He turned and walked away, but before disappearing around the corner of the hall, he looked back one more time. Ashton was lowering himself into the hard, uncomfortable seat outside the room, directly across from the glass door. He sat there with his back straight, his eyes fixed on Rachel. Ray gave the slightest shake of his head, then kept walking. 3 o'clock in the morning. Jonah and Micah had gone into the room and fallen asleep on the small sofa beside their mother's bed. Micah was curled in his brother's arms, his little hand still wrapped around Jonah's finger even in sleep. And Ashton was still outside in the hallway, alone, watching through the glass. He didn't sleep. He didn't leave. He simply sat there, guarding the sleep of the woman he had lost 8 years before. Early morning sunlight slipped through the curtains and woke Rachel from the longest sleep she had known since being admitted to the hospital. She blinked several times, trying to bring her vision into focus. Something was different. The ceiling was higher. The room was larger. There was more light. She turned her head slightly and saw a vase of fresh flowers resting on a bedside table made of pale wood. White lilies, their petals smooth and pure. She didn't remember being moved to another room. She didn't remember anyone bringing flowers. Her eyes drifted toward the corner of the room. On a large sofa, upholstered in green velvet, Jonah was curled up asleep, with Micah folded against him in a tight little bundle. Both of them were still sleeping. Jonah's face looked paler and thinner than the last time she had seen him awake. Her heart tightened at the sight. How much had her son endured in the days she had lain here helpless? Then she saw the figure standing at the foot of her bed. A man was standing there. Tall, broad-shouldered, black suit. He stood as still as a statue, his eyes fixed on her with something she couldn't name. Rachel blinked again. She thought she was dreaming. She thought the fever had returned and was making her see things that weren't real. But then the man moved. He took one step forward. And Rachel knew. Gray-blue eyes, harsh, sculpted features, the faint scar running from the corner of his left eye down across his cheekbone. 8 years wasn't enough to make her forget that face. 1,000,000 years wouldn't have been enough. Rachel's eyes widened, then everything inside her seemed to go dark. Her whole body turned rigid, as though someone had poured ice water directly into her veins. Her heart slammed wildly against her ribs. The monitor beside her bed began to beep faster and faster. "Get out of here." Her voice was cold as ice, not trembling, not shouting, just cold, cold enough to freeze the whole room. "Rachel, I need to explain. Get out of here, right now." This time she screamed, not because she was angry, because she was afraid. Afraid that if he stayed 1 second longer, the wall she had spent 8 years building would collapse completely. Her hands were shaking. She tried to hide it by clutching the blanket tightly, but Ashton saw it. He saw everything. He saw the pain she was trying to conceal. He saw the fury she was trying to keep under control. He saw 8 years of bitterness burning in the eyes that had once looked at him with love. Rachel tried to sit up, and the sudden movement sent the heart monitor into alarm. The sharp, relentless beeping filled the room. The door flew open. 2 nurses rushed in. their eyes darting to the numbers flashing on the screen. "Miss Mercer, you need to lie back down. You mustn't get upset." Rachel didn't look at them. Her eyes stayed locked on Ashton, and one trembling hand lifted to point straight at him. "I don't want this man here. Get him out of my room." The nurses looked at Ashton, then at Rachel, then at each other. They didn't know what to do. This man had just paid the patient's entire hospital bill. This man was Ashton Sterling. But the patient was demanding that he leave, and the patient came first. "Sir," one of the nurses said at last, her voice polite but firm, "please step outside. The patient needs to rest." On the sofa, Jonah jolted awake at the noise. He pulled Micah tightly against his chest, his eyes wide with panic as he looked around. He saw his mother sitting up in bed, her face flushed red, her hand pointed toward the man from the night before. He saw the man standing there like stone, his eyes never leaving his mother. He didn't understand what was happening. Why was his mother so angry? Why did the kind man from last night make her react as though he were the enemy? Ashton looked at Rachel one last time. He didn't say anything. He didn't explain. He didn't beg. He only gave the faintest nod, then turned and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him. Rachel fell back against the pillow, her eyes squeezed shut, her chest rising and falling hard. The nurses hurried to check the monitors and adjust the IV lines. Jonah remained frozen on the sofa, holding Micah, afraid to move. He looked at his mother, then he looked through the glass door. The man hadn't gone anywhere. He was sitting down once more in the waiting area out in the hallway, in the exact same place where he had sat all through the night before, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the room. Waiting. Jonah didn't know what he was waiting for. He only knew that this man hadn't left, even after his mother had screamed in his face. He was still here, and somehow, for reasons Jonah couldn't explain, that stirred something inside him he had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. After the nurses left, the room sank into silence. Rachel lay in bed with her eyes closed, her chest still rising and falling from the force of what she had just endured. Jonah sat on the sofa with Micah in his arms, afraid to move. He was afraid that if he shifted even a little, his mother would start screaming again. He was afraid that if he said anything at all, everything would shatter. But then Rachel opened her eyes. She turned and looked at her son, and for the first time since waking, she truly saw him. Jonah, how thin he had become. His cheekbones stood out sharply in that childlike face. Dark shadows lay beneath his eyes. His lips were dry and cracked. His hands were roughened. The shoulder of his hoodie was torn, and she couldn't even remember when it had first ripped. 19 days. 19 days she had lain here, and out there in the world, what kind of life had her son been forced to live? "Come here, sweetheart," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "Come here to me." Jonah stood, carrying Micah, and walked to his mother's bed. Rachel reached for them and pulled both of her boys into her arms. She held them tightly, so tightly Jonah could barely breathe. But he didn't complain. He only closed his eyes and let himself sink into his mother's embrace. For the first time in 19 days, he felt safe. Rachel cried. Not with loud, broken sobs, just tears slipping quietly down her cheeks, soaking into Jonah's hair. She cried from guilt, from pain, from the unbearable knowledge that her son had been carrying burdens no 8-year-old child should ever have to carry. "Tell me," Rachel whispered. "Tell me what you've done these last 19 days. Jonah told her, briefly, without complaint, without dramatizing anything, just the truth. He told her about taking care of Micah alone, changing diapers, feeding him, rocking him to sleep. He told her about the days he had spent begging for money. Outside churches, supermarkets, gas stations, street corners. He told her about being chased away, about being ignored, about the times when someone stopped long enough to hand him a few coins. He told her about Pearl, the woman from the upstairs apartment, the neighbor who had given him $50 and watched Micah whenever he had to go farther away. But she was poor too. She had nothing more left to give. Rachel listened. Every sentence Jonah spoke felt like a blade cutting deeper into her heart. She closed her eyes, but the tears kept falling. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice shaking. "I'm sorry you had to do all of that alone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you. I'm sorry, Jonah. I'm so sorry." She held him even tighter, as though she were afraid that if she let go, he would disappear. As though if she released him, She would lose him the way she had lost so many other things in her life. Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Mom, who is that man?" Rachel went still. Her arms were still wrapped around her son, but her body suddenly tightened like a drawn wire. She didn't answer right away. Silence stretched between them. 1 second. 2, 5, 10. "Someone I used to know," Rachel said at last, her voice distant. "A long time ago. Before you were born." Jonah thought about that answer. He knew she was hiding something. He could feel it, but he didn't press her. Instead, he said the one thing he knew for certain. "He paid your hospital bill. All of it." Rachel closed her eyes. She drew in a long, slow breath, as though trying to hold back a storm raging inside her. "Money," she said bitterly. "That's all he's ever known how to give." Jonah fell silent. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he saw something he had never truly seen before. His mother had wounds too, not wounds on her body, not wounds from sickness, but wounds that lay somewhere deeper, wounds that had healed over, yet had never truly disappeared, wounds from the past, wounds tied to the man sitting out in the hallway. Jonah didn't know what had happened between his mother and that man. He didn't know why she was so angry. He didn't know what their relationship had once been. But he knew one thing. That man had hurt his mother, hurt her deeply. "Mom," he asked softly, "did he hurt you?" Rachel didn't answer. She only held him tighter, her eyes turning toward the glass door where the man's figure still sat motionless in the cold chair outside her room out in the hallway. That silence was the answer, and Jonah understood. The next day, Pearl came to visit. She was Rachel's upstairs neighbor, the woman who had helped Jonah through the hardest of those dark days. When she stepped into the VIP hospital room and saw how much everything had changed, her eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't ask questions. She only looked at Rachel with a gaze full of worry and quiet sorrow. Rachel asked her to take Jonah and Micah outside for a little while. She needed to speak with someone. Alone, Pearl nodded and led Jonah out of the room. Before leaving, Jonah turned back to look at his mother, then glanced toward the hallway where the man was still sitting and waiting. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were full of questions. Rachel gave the faintest nod. "Go on, sweetheart. I'll be all right." Once Jonah and Pearl had disappeared from view, Rachel drew in a long, steady breath. She looked toward the glass door. Ashton was still there, still sitting in that waiting area, still waiting. Through the whole night and now through the better part of the day, she closed her eyes for a second, then called for a nurse and asked her to bring the man from the hallway inside. Ashton stepped into the room. The door closed behind him. At once, the room seemed smaller, the air inside it thicker. He stood at the foot of the bed, keeping his distance, not daring to come any closer. "Go ahead," Rachel said first, her voice cold and hard as steel. "Say whatever it is you came to say, then leave." Ashton looked at her. 8 years. For 8 years he had searched for this face, and now she was lying here, looking at him as though he were the enemy. "I didn't know," he said, his voice low and rough. "About the boy. I swear to you, I didn't know." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. There was no joy in it, only irony, bitterness, and pain sharpened into something cruel. "You left. That's all that matters." "I was sent away," Ashton said. "My father needed me in Miami. He didn't give me a choice." Rachel shook her head. "There's always a choice. You just didn't choose me." The words landed like a knife driven straight into Ashton's chest. He clenched his jaw, fighting to keep himself under control. "I came back," he said. 6 months later. You were gone. Different address, different phone number. No one knew where you'd gone. "Because I couldn't keep waiting for someone who was never coming back," Rachel answered, her voice trembling just slightly, though she fought to keep it steady. "I did come back," Ashton said again, this time more sharply, his voice rising. "You weren't there anymore." Silence filled the room. They looked at each other, and between them stood 8 years of bitterness, 8 years of misunderstanding, 8 years of pain, 8 years in which Rachel believed she had been abandoned. 8 years in which Ashton believed she had chosen to disappear. An invisible wall stood between them, high and thick, built from silence and assumption. "It doesn't matter anymore," Rachel said at last, exhaustion weighing down every word. "It's been 8 years. I raised him alone. I don't need you now." "I know," Ashton said with a quiet nod. "But he's still my son." And I'm not walking away again. Rachel looked at him, her eyes sharp and cold. We'll see. Ashton didn't answer. He knew there were no words that could convince her now. Words had become worthless after 8 years of silence. Only action could prove anything. He straightened, then turned and walked toward the door. His hand rested on the handle, but he didn't open it right away. He turned back to look at Rachel one more time. "I'll be here," he said, his voice softer now, but steady. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Then he opened the door and stepped out. The door closed behind him. Rachel watched his shadow through the glass. He didn't go back to the same uncomfortable seat. He stood there for a moment with his back to her, his shoulders slightly bowed. Then he began walking down the hallway and disappeared around the corner. Rachel didn't call him back. She didn't say a word, but her eyes shimmered, and the hand clutching the blanket trembled faintly. For 8 years, she had told herself she hated him. For 8 years, she had built walls around her heart. For 8 years, she had lived as though he no longer existed. But now, after hearing him say he had come back, that he had searched for her, something deep inside her had begun to shift. She didn't know what it was. She only knew that it hurt. It hurt more than anger, more than resentment. And she was afraid. Afraid that if she let those walls collapse, she would have nothing left to protect herself with. 1 week later, Rachel was discharged from the hospital. She returned to the basement apartment in South Side, the place she had called home for the past 8 years. Pearl helped her clean, cook porridge, and look after the boys. On the surface, everything seemed to be returning to normal, but nothing was truly normal anymore, not after everything that had happened. That afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Pearl was sitting in the room with Rachel, the two of them speaking softly. Jonah was feeding Micah in the corner by the stove. The knock came again. Pearl rose and went to open the door. Then she stopped cold. Standing before her was a tall man in a long black coat, broad-shouldered, with a face as hard and cold as something carved from stone. She recognized him at once, not because she had ever met him before, but because everyone in South Side knew that name. Blackwood, Ashton Sterling, the boss, the man who held half the city in his hands. Pearl didn't step back. She stood in the doorway, 62 years old, silver hair twisted into a bun, eyes sharp as blades. She wasn't afraid. She had lived too long to still know fear. "I know who you are," she said, her voice cold and hard. "I know what you do." Ashton looked at her. He wasn't surprised. He was used to that kind of look. The look of people who had lost something to the world he belonged to. "Then you know I can protect them," he said. "Protect?" Pearl let out a bitter laugh, one with no trace of humor in it. "My son died because of men like you. Gang violence. He was only 19. Ashton said nothing. He had no answer for that. He hadn't known her son. He didn't know the story. But he knew that in his world, there were thousands of stories just like it. Thousands of mothers who had buried their children. Thousands of families shattered beyond repair. And whether he wanted it or not, he was part of that world. "And you think I'll let you anywhere near these children?" Pearl went on, her voice shaking now with fury. "You'll step over my dead body first." Ashton looked at her. He wasn't angry. He understood. He had seen too much loss to still feel anger toward people who hated him. "I didn't come here to ask for your approval," he said, his voice low but clear. "I came because that boy is my son." Pearl didn't answer. "I won't let him stand out in the cold begging for money while I live in a penthouse," Ashton continued. "You can hate me, but don't make the children pay for that." Pearl held his gaze for a long time. A very long time. Her eyes searched every line of his face, looking for the smallest sign of deceit. She had met too many men in her life who spoke beautifully, men who made promises and vanished, men who arrived with sweet words and left ruin behind them. "Fine words," she said at last. "I've heard plenty of fine words before." "Then don't listen to what I say," Ashton replied. "Watch what I do." Silence settled between them. Cold wind drifted in from the street through the narrow doorway. Pearl stood there blocking the entrance, looking at the most powerful man in Chicago as though he were someone asking permission to come inside. He could have shoved past her. He could have called for men to do it for him. He could have done whatever he wanted, but he stood there, waiting. At last, Pearl stepped aside, not because she believed him, not because she forgave him, but because she wanted to see. She wanted to see whether this man would keep his word. She wanted to see whether he was any different from the others who had come and gone in Rachel's life. Ashton stepped across the threshold, and then he stopped. The tiny basement apartment opened before him, walls mottled with damp stains, a low ceiling. The narrow window, barely inches above the pavement, offered a grim view of the world, just the hurried footsteps of people who never knew a child was watching from below. One narrow bed, an old gas stove, a wooden table with peeling paint. This was where his son had lived for 8 years. This was where Rachel had raised that boy on her own. This was all they had. Ashton looked around. He saw Jonah standing in the corner near the stove, holding Micah, his eyes fixed on him with a mix of caution and curiosity. He saw Rachel lying on the bed, her face still pale, her gaze on him unreadable. He saw an entire life he had missed. 8 years. 8 years he had spent living in a penthouse overlooking the city. 8 years his son had spent living in a basement apartment looking out at nothing but the feet of strangers. Ashton said nothing. He only stood there, in the middle of that cramped room, and felt the full weight of 8 lost years settle onto his shoulders. 2 weeks later, Ashton had begun visiting regularly. Not every single day, but often enough that Jonah started recognizing the sound of his footsteps on the stairs leading down to the basement. The first time he brought food, Rachel refused it. She said they didn't need it. She said she could take care of herself. She said she didn't want to accept anything from him. But Micah was hungry, and when the cries of the 18-month-old child filled the room, Rachel closed her eyes, clenched her jaw, and finally gave a small nod, allowing Ashton to set the bag of food on the table. After that, he brought groceries each time he came. He didn't say much. He didn't make a show of it. He simply set everything down, then took a seat in the corner of the room, keeping the distance Rachel demanded. He started playing chess with Jonah. It was an old chessboard he had brought with him on his 3rd visit. Jonah had never played before, but he learned quickly. Ashton taught him each move with patience, never rushing him. Sometimes they would sit for an hour just to finish one game. Neither of them said very much, but the silence between them no longer felt as heavy as it once had. With Micah, Ashton read books. Picture books he bought from a bookstore on the way over. Micah didn't understand much, but he liked the deep warmth of Ashton's voice. He liked looking at the bright-colored illustrations. He liked sitting on the lap of this grown man he didn't really know. One afternoon, while Rachel was asleep and Pearl had gone back upstairs, Jonah suddenly stopped moving his chess piece. He looked up, his eyes fixed directly on Ashton. "You're my father, aren't you?" The question came without warning, but Ashton wasn't surprised. He had been waiting for it for a long time. He just hadn't known when it would finally come. "Yes," he answered, his voice low and steady. "Why did you leave?" Ashton took a breath. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't blame anyone else. He only told the truth, in the simplest way he could. "I made a mistake. I left when I shouldn't have left. And when I came back, I couldn't find your mother." Jonah sat in silence, turning that answer over in his mind. Then he asked the next question, the one he had carried somewhere inside himself for 8 years without even knowing how deeply he had been carrying it. "So it wasn't because you didn't want me?" Ashton looked at the boy. 8 years old, thin and solemn. Gray-blue eyes exactly like his own. Eyes that had already seen too much, endured too much, for any child. He lowered himself onto one knee so they were eye to eye. "I didn't know you existed," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But now I know, and I'm not going anywhere." Jonah looked at him. For a long time. A very long time. Then he nodded. Just nodded. No embrace. No tears. No more words. But for a boy who had lost faith in adults long ago, that single nod meant a great deal. Everything seemed, at last, to be settling into something steadier. But the world of Ashton Sterling never allowed peace to last for long. 1 week after that conversation, Jonah was walking home from school as usual. The walk took about 15 minutes through the familiar streets of South Side. But that day, something felt different. 2 men were standing at the corner, right near the entrance to the alley leading down to the basement apartment. They wore black jackets and low caps, their hands shoved into their pockets. As Jonah passed, one of them stepped forward and blocked his path. "Hey, kid." Jonah stopped. The instincts of someone who had once survived 15 days on the street made him go instantly still and alert. "Does some man come by your place a lot?" the second one asked. "Tall, expensive clothes, drives a shiny black car." Jonah didn't say a word. He just stared at them with eyes cold as stone, then suddenly slipped through the gap between them and ran. He ran as fast as he could without looking back until he reached the stairs, charged down them, and pounded on the apartment door. That night, Ray came to see Ashton at the penthouse. He brought bad news. "Someone's asking questions about you, boss. Morrison's crew. They know you've been going down to South Side. They're trying to find out why." Ashton stood at the window overlooking the city, his back to Ray, his hand tightened. "Do they know about the boy yet?" "Not for sure. But if they keep digging, it's only a matter of time." Silence. Ashton had known this was coming. He knew that in his world, any weakness would eventually be found and exploited. And now he had a weakness he couldn't walk away from. "Put men on the area," he ordered, his voice cold as steel. 24 hours a day. But keep it discreet. Rachel mustn't know." "Yes, boss." The next day, Ashton came to the apartment earlier than usual. He waited until Rachel was busy feeding Micah, then motioned for Jonah to step outside into the hallway so they could speak alone. Jonah followed him out and stood at the bottom of the stairs, looking up. "Someone asked you about me yesterday, didn't they?" Jonah nodded. "If anyone asks about me again, you don't know anything," Ashton said, his voice grave. "You've never met me. You don't know who I am. Do you understand?" Jonah was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Are we in danger?" Ashton looked at the boy, 8 years old, and yet his eyes were far older than his age. Eyes that had seen far too much to be soothed by empty reassurances. "Not while I'm still alive," Ashton answered. His voice didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a fact. Jonah looked at him, and for the first time, he saw Ashton differently. No longer as the stranger who had paid the hospital bill. No longer as the man who had abandoned his mother. No longer as the crime boss the whole city feared. But as someone willing to protect him. Someone willing to stand between him and whatever danger might come. For the first time in his life, Jonah understood what it felt like to have a father, and he didn't know what to do with that feeling. Rachel watched from the bed. She didn't join in. She didn't speak to Ashton any more than necessary. But she watched. She watched Ashton sitting on the floor with Jonah, the chessboard laid between them. He patiently taught the boy each move, never rushing, never showing irritation when Jonah made mistakes. Once, Jonah made the wrong move and lost his queen, and in frustration, he nearly swept the board over. Ashton simply reset the pieces with quiet hands, then told him that losing one game didn't mean losing the whole war. Jonah sat back down and kept playing. She watched Ashton read to Micah. The 18-month-old child sat in his lap, one small hand wrapped around one of Ashton's large fingers, his eyes fixed on the pictures in the book. Ashton's voice was low and warm, nothing like the cold voice she had heard in the hospital. He read slowly, sometimes pointing to an image and asking Micah a question, even though he knew the boy couldn't answer yet. Micah laughed, clapped his hands, and babbled strings of meaningless sounds. And Ashton, the man the whole city feared, laughed with him. She watched all of it, and she didn't know what to think. One evening, after Ashton had left, Pearl sat down beside Rachel. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "He's not like I thought he was." Rachel looked at her. "He's still dangerous." "Maybe," Pearl said with a shrug. "But dangerous men don't sit on the floor reading picture books to children." Rachel didn't answer. She had nothing to say to that. Pearl was right. Ashton wasn't what she had imagined. He didn't come bearing empty promises. He didn't pressure her to forgive him. He didn't demand the right to be a father. He simply showed up, brought food, played chess with Jonah, read to Micah, then left. Day after day. No display, no complaints, nothing but patience. Rachel stopped sending him away early. She began letting him stay for dinner. Quiet meals, the four of them gathered around the small table. Micah in Jonah's lap, Ashton sitting across from Rachel. No one said much, but the silence no longer felt tense the way it once had. It was beginning to feel like the silence of people learning how to exist beside one another. One evening, when Ashton stood to leave, Jonah suddenly ran to the door. The boy stopped in the doorway and looked up at the tall man. "Are you coming tomorrow?" Ashton looked down at him. Then he nodded. "Yes." Jonah said nothing more. He only nodded back, then turned and went inside. But Rachel saw it. She saw the look in her son's eyes, the look of waiting, the look of a child beginning to trust someone. For the first time in 8 years, Jonah was waiting for someone. And Rachel didn't know whether she should feel relieved or afraid. Relieved, because her son finally had a father. Or afraid, because if Ashton disappeared again, this time the boy would shatter. A month passed. Rachel was much stronger now. She could move around the apartment on her own, cook on her own, care for the boys on her own. Color had returned to her cheeks. There was light in her eyes again. She had begun to talk more, to smile more, though her smile still hadn't fully become what it once was. One weekend afternoon, she decided to clean the apartment. It had been far too long since she had the strength to do something like that. Belongings were piled in the corners of the room. Old clothes needed to be thrown away. Papers needed to be sorted. Jonah helped his mother. He carried cardboard boxes from the corners of the room to the middle of the floor and opened them to see what was inside. Most of it was old things no longer used, papers from years ago. Rachel sat on the bed sorting through clothes. Micah was napping on the sofa. The room was quiet except for the rustle of paper, and Rachel's voice now and then telling Jonah to keep this, throw that away. Jonah opened a box of old documents. Inside were paid bills from years earlier, certificates, scraps of paper that no longer had any value. He was about to close the box when he noticed an envelope at the bottom. It was yellowed with age, its corners crumpled as though it had been crushed and then smoothed out again many times. He picked it up. He looked at the date in the corner of the envelope. 8 years ago. 8 years ago, his mother had sent this letter to Miami, and it had come back. Jonah's heart began to pound faster. He glanced toward Rachel. She was busy sorting clothes and wasn't paying attention to him. Jonah stood, holding the envelope, and moved to the corner near the stove, turning his back. He opened it gently, carefully, as though he were opening a bomb that might explode at any second. Inside was a handwritten letter, 2 sheets of paper folded into thirds. His mother's handwriting, but not the same handwriting she had now. It looked younger, softer, more fragile. Jonah began to read. Ashton, I don't know if I should write this letter. I don't know if you want to hear from me, but I have to tell you. I'm pregnant. 2 months now. The doctor says I'll have the baby in the winter. Jonah stopped breathing. Then he kept reading. I know you had to leave. I know you didn't have a choice, but I'm begging you to come back. I'll wait. I promise I'll wait. As long as you come back, everything will be all right. We'll find a way. We'll get through it together. I love you. I'll always love you. Please come back to me. The letter ended there. No signature. Only a small heart drawn in ink at the bottom of the page. Jonah stood there holding the letter, and the whole world seemed to stop turning. His mother had written to him. His mother had tried to reach him. His mother had begged Ashton to come back. His mother had promised she would wait, but the letter had never reached him. The address didn't exist. The letter had been returned, and Rachel had believed Ashton never answered because he didn't want to, while Ashton had believed she disappeared because she didn't want to see him. 8 years. 8 years of bitterness. 8 years of misunderstanding. 8 years of his mother raising him alone. 8 years of Jonah growing up without a father. All because of a letter that never reached the right place. A mistake by the post office. A senseless accident. An envelope stamped in red and thrown into the bottom of a box, only to be forgotten. Jonah didn't cry. He had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. But his hands shook. They shook so badly that he had to hold the letter with both hands to keep from dropping it. He thought about the nights he had stood out in the cold, Micah strapped against his chest, holding his mother's picture while begging for money. He thought about the times his mother worked 3 shifts just to make enough to pay the rent. He thought about meals that had been nothing but plain rice and salt. He thought about everything they had endured, and all because of one letter. Jonah folded the letter again, slipped it back into the envelope, and tucked it into his hoodie pocket. Then he went back to where his mother was sitting and kept helping her clean as though nothing had happened. Rachel didn't know. He wasn't going to tell her. Not yet. That night, after his mother and Micah had fallen asleep, Jonah took his mother's phone and found Ashton's number saved in her contacts. He sent a text. I need to see you. Alone. A few seconds later, a reply came back. When? Tomorrow. After school. All right. I'll pick you up. Jonah turned off the phone and put it back where it had been. Then he lay down beside Micah, his eyes fixed on the dark ceiling. The letter rested in his pocket, heavy as a stone. Ashton needed to know. He needed to know that Rachel hadn't abandoned him, that she had tried to find him, that she had waited. And Jonah was going to be the one to tell him, because it was the right thing to do. Because maybe, just maybe, This truth would change something. Between his mother and Ashton. Between Ashton and them. Between all the broken pieces of the last 8 years. The following afternoon, Ashton came to pick Jonah up after school. The boy climbed into the car without saying a word, only giving Ray a small nod of greeting in the driver's seat. Ashton sat beside him, looking at his son with eyes full of questions, but he didn't ask. He knew Jonah would speak when he was ready. The car stopped at a park near Southside. It was a small park, with a few old wooden benches, a playground gone rusty with age, and maple trees shedding yellow leaves. There weren't many people there at that hour. Only a few mothers pushing strollers and an old man tossing crumbs to pigeons. Jonah and Ashton sat down on a bench in the far corner of the park, away from everyone else. Ray stayed near the car, keeping his distance, scanning the area out of habit. Jonah was quiet for a long time. He looked down at his worn shoes, then over at Ashton, then back at the ground. At last, he slipped a hand into his pocket and pulled out the yellowed envelope. He handed it to Ashton without saying a word. Ashton took the envelope. He looked at the return address. Miami. He looked at the date. 8 years ago. He looked at the red stamp. Return to sender. Address unknown. His hand began to tremble. He opened the envelope, pulled out the letter, and unfolded it crease by crease. Then he read. His eyes moved over each line, then stopped, then went back and began again from the top, then stopped at the same line. I am pregnant, 2 months now. He read that line 3 times, 4 times, 5, as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing, as though those words had no meaning at all. She wrote to me, Ashton said, his voice so hoarse it sounded as though someone were closing a hand around his throat. It wasn't a question. It was a realization, the confirmation of something he had never once allowed himself to imagine. The letter came back, Jonah said, his voice soft but clear. The address didn't exist. Ashton closed his eyes. He remembered. 8 years ago, when he had been in Miami, his father had changed addresses constantly. A new place every week, a new phone number every month, to avoid being tracked, to avoid enemies, to protect the family, but also to sever every tie to the past. Rachel's letter had been swallowed inside that chaos. It had gone to Miami, but the address Ashton had given her before he left no longer existed. The letter had been returned, and Rachel had believed he had received it and chosen not to answer, while he had believed she disappeared because she no longer wanted him. She wrote, Ashton said, his eyes still closed. She waited, and I never knew. He opened his eyes and looked down at the letter. His eyes were red, but no tears fell. Men like him had forgotten how to cry a long time ago, but something in him looked hollowed out, as though every bone had been pulled from his body, leaving only a shell behind. I thought she left because she didn't want me, he said, his voice broken and uneven. All these years, that's what I thought. She thought the same thing about you, Jonah said. Silence followed. Father and son sat together on the park bench without speaking. The autumn wind moved softly through the air, carrying yellow leaves across the ground at their feet. The laughter of children at the playground drifted toward them, faint and far away, as though it belonged to some other world. Ashton sat there with the letter in his hands and thought about 8 years. 8 years of searching for Rachel. 8 years of resenting her for leaving. 8 years of living with the pain of a man who believed he had been abandoned. And all of it had come from a misunderstanding. A lost letter. An address that no longer existed. An envelope stamped in red and tossed into a dark corner. At last, Ashton stood up. I need to tell her, he said. I know, Jonah answered. Ashton looked down at his son. The 8-year-old boy sat on the bench with his feet not even touching the ground, looking up at him with a gravity no child that age should ever have had to carry. Thank you, Ashton said, his voice thick with emotion, for showing me this. My mom deserves to know the truth, Jonah said. So do you. Ashton gave a single nod. Then he pulled out his phone and called Rachel. The line rang, once, twice, 3 times. Then she answered. Hello? Rachel's voice came through, tired but alert. The letter, Ashton said, without preamble, without giving his name. I just found out. I never received it. I need to see you. Silence answered him from the other end of the line. Long, heavy. Ashton could hear Rachel breathing. Faster now, more uneven. What letter? She asked, her voice trembling. The letter you sent me 8 years ago, when you told me you were pregnant, it was returned. The address didn't exist. I never got it, Rachel. I never knew you had written to me. Silence again. Then a sob. Small, strangled. Then crying. Not the crying of anger. Not the crying of pain. But the crying of someone who had just been released from a burden she had carried for 8 long years. Jonah sat on the park bench, listening to his father speak on the phone, listening to his mother cry on the other end of the line. And in that moment, he knew he had done the right thing. The truth could wound. But the truth could heal, too. That evening, Ashton came to the basement apartment. Jonah and Micah were already asleep, the two brothers curled together on the small bed, with Micah babbling happily, reaching for the buttons on Ashton's suit. Pearl had gone home after making sure the boys were settled for the night. The apartment was quiet. There was only the slow drip of water from the broken kitchen faucet, and the soft whistle of wind slipping through the crack by the window. Rachel sat at the kitchen table, her back straight, both hands resting on the surface in front of her. Ashton sat across from her, the wooden chair creaking faintly beneath his weight. Between them, on the table, lay the letter, the yellowed envelope with its bright red stamp. Return to sender, address unknown. They sat in silence for a long while. Neither of them spoke first. Neither of them seemed to know where to begin. At last, Rachel reached for the envelope. She didn't open it. She only held it in her hands, her fingers brushing over the faded handwriting that had once been her own 8 years earlier. I wrote this letter the day after I found out I was pregnant, she said, her voice soft as breath. I was so sure you would come back. I thought you only needed time. I thought that once you received it, you would understand, and you would come back to me. She stopped, drawing in a deep breath. When it came back, I thought you didn't want us. Ashton looked at her. He could see 8 years of suffering written across her face. Sleepless nights, exhausting days of work, all those moments when she had forced herself to believe she was strong enough to survive alone, all because of a misunderstanding. I never knew, he said, his voice low and steady. I swear on everything I have, I never knew you wrote to me. I never knew you waited. He reached a hand toward the letter, but didn't touch it, as though it were too fragile to bear the weight of his fingers. My father kept changing addresses back then, a new place every week, to avoid being tracked, to protect the family. The address I gave you was a secure drop-off point. My father had it shut down and scrubbed clean the moment I arrived in Miami to ensure I had no links to my past. He ensured every bridge was burned, closing down the secure mail drop-off I had given you. The letter hadn't just been lost. It had been rejected by a man determined to keep his son away from his past. I never knew he had blocked your only way to reach me. Your letter was lost in that system, and when I came back, you were already gone. Silence followed. Rachel looked down at the letter in her hands. Tears began to fall. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears sliding down her cheeks and dropping onto the wooden table. She was crying, but not out of anger, not out of pain, out of relief. For 8 years, she had carried the burden of a woman who believed she had been abandoned. For 8 years, she had taught herself to hate Ashton. For 8 years, she had told herself she didn't need anyone, didn't need any man, didn't need anyone except herself. But the truth was that she had not been abandoned. The truth was that Ashton had never received the letter. The truth was that they had both been victims of bad timing, of a changed address, of an envelope sent back, of an imperfect postal system. No one had set out to hurt the other. No one had chosen to walk away. Life itself, with all its cruelty and randomness, had simply pushed them apart. I can't forgive 8 years in one night, Rachel said, her voice still trembling with tears. I'm not asking you to, Ashton replied. Rachel lifted her head and looked at him. Her eyes were red, her cheeks wet, but the look in them was no longer as frozen as it had once been. But I think I can try to stop hating you, she said. Ashton nodded slowly. That's enough. Right now, that's enough. They didn't embrace. They didn't kiss. They didn't speak words of love or make promises about the future. They only sat there, in that small kitchen, with the letter lying between them, and let the silence fill the room. But this silence was different. It wasn't heavy and strained the way it had been before. It was gentler now, softer, as though some invisible wall had finally fallen, and for the first time in 8 years, they could breathe the same air without feeling like they were suffocating. Rachel looked out the window, where the darkness of the south side night covered everything. Ashton looked down at his hands that had done many things in this life, but had never done the one thing that mattered most, which was to be there for his family. They sat there, two people who had once loved each other, had once lost each other, and were now trying to learn how to exist beside one another again. Not as lovers, not yet even as friends, just as two adults who shared responsibility for an 8-year-old boy and an 18-month-old child. But for the first time in 8 years, they were sitting on the same side, and that was a beginning. 2 months passed. Everything began to change in small but unmistakable ways. Ashton came to visit regularly now, no longer hesitant, no longer keeping the careful distance he once had. Rachel no longer tensed every time he appeared. She allowed him to pick Jonah up after school every Saturday, to take the boy out, to bring him to the office at Sterling Tower. The first time Jonah stepped into that building, he stopped in the lobby and stood frozen, his head tilted back as he stared up at the soaring ceiling above him. He had never seen a place like this before. Floors of gleaming marble, glass elevators, employees in suits moving with serious expressions on their faces, and every one of them lowered their head in greeting when Ashton walked by. Ashton's office was on the highest floor, a vast room with walls of glass overlooking the whole of Chicago. Jonah stood in front of the window for a long time, his eyes drifting over the tiny streets below, the cars no bigger than toys, the people like ants. He thought about his basement apartment, where the window showed nothing but the legs of passers-by. Two worlds so different it was hard to believe they could exist inside the same city. But Jonah wasn't shy. He spun the boss's chair in a full circle and laughed when it whirled around. He stared at the world map on the wall and asked hundreds of questions. What country is this? Have you been here? Why is this part red? What does this pin mean? Ashton answered every question with patience, without the slightest trace of irritation. Company employees passing by the boss's office glanced inside and could hardly believe what they were seeing. Ashton Sterling was laughing, sitting on the floor with a child, explaining a map in a voice they had never heard from him before. Warm, patient, human. Ray stood out in the hallway, watching. A young employee came to stand beside him and whispered, "Who is that boy?" Ray looked into the office, where Jonah was spinning the chair for the 5th time, and Ashton was shaking his head with a smile. "That boy did what none of us ever could," Ray said. "He brought the boss back to being human." One Saturday afternoon, back in the basement apartment, Ashton and Jonah were playing chess as usual. The board was set on the floor, the two of them sitting across from each other. Micah was playing with a pile of toys in the corner. Rachel was cooking in the kitchen. The game lasted more than an hour. Jonah had improved a great deal over the last 2 months. He didn't make foolish mistakes anymore. He had started thinking several moves ahead. He had started learning how to set traps. And that afternoon, for the first time, he put Ashton in checkmate. He moved his rook into the final position, then looked up with shining eyes. "Do you see it, Dad?" he said, his voice bright with excitement. Then he froze. Ashton froze. Both of them fell silent. Jonah realized what he had just said. For the first time, he had called Ashton by that word. Dad. Not Mr. Not Ashton. Dad. No one spoke for several seconds. The air in the room seemed to turn solid. Then Ashton gave a slight nod, gentle and steady. "I see it. That's a good move." His voice sounded normal. His face looked normal, but when he reached down to gather the chess pieces and set the board back in place, his hand was trembling. Ray, who was standing in the doorway waiting to drive Ashton home, saw it. He had been beside Ashton for nearly 20 years. He had never seen the boss's hand shake like that. Never. At that same moment, Micah crawled over to Ashton. The 18-month-old child, with soft brown hair and big round eyes, sat down beside him and held up a stuffed bear, as if wanting to show it off. Ashton turned toward him, took the bear, and pretended to speak to it. Micah laughed and clapped his hands. Then he tipped his head back, looked up at Ashton, and babbled. "Da-da." Ashton froze for the second time in less than a minute. The 18-month-old had just called him Dad. Jonah burst out laughing. The sound rang clear and bright through the tiny room. For the first time since his mother had gone into the hospital, Jonah laughed for real, not a forced smile. Not the kind of laugh meant to hide something, but the laugh of an 8-year-old boy finally allowed to be an 8-year-old boy. Rachel stood in the kitchen doorway, still holding the wooden spoon in her hand. She saw everything. The three of them on the floor, Ashton holding the stuffed bear, Jonah laughing, Micah babbling, like a normal family, like the kind of family she had never dared dream of during those 8 long years. She didn't step into the room. She only stood there, leaning against the frame of the doorway, and smiled. Not complete forgiveness. She wasn't capable of complete forgiveness yet. 8 years couldn't be erased in 2 months. Not forgetting the past. She couldn't forget the past. The wounds were still there, even if they had begun to heal. But it was a beginning. A new beginning. For Jonah. For Micah. And maybe, just maybe, for her too. 6 months after that fateful night, Pearl hosted a dinner in her apartment upstairs. The little kitchen was warm with the smell of braised chicken, a family recipe she had been cooking for 40 years. 5 people sat around the old wooden table. Rachel sat beside Jonah. Micah sat in his mother's lap, his small hand still wrapped around his brother's finger. Ashton sat across from them, his back as straight as ever, though his shoulders were no longer as rigid as they had once been. Pearl sat at the head of the table, where she always sat whenever guests came over. She spooned braised chicken onto each plate, with the easy skill of someone who had done this thousands of times. Ashton took his first bite. Then he looked up at Pearl. "This is the best thing I've ever eaten," he said, and his voice was completely sincere. Pearl's expression didn't change. "Of course it is. I've been making it for 40 years. Jonah burst out laughing. Micah clapped his hands, even though he had no idea what was happening. Rachel smiled, the first true smile she had worn through the whole meal. Ashton looked around the little kitchen. The pale yellow paint on the walls had begun to peel in the corners. The old cabinets no longer closed all the way. The wooden table was marked with scratches and round burn scars from hot pots set down over the years. There was nothing luxurious here, nothing expensive. It was only the ordinary kitchen of an ordinary old woman in South Side. But this was the very thing he had been missing all his life. Family. He had possessed power. He had possessed money. All of Chicago knew his name. All of Chicago feared him. But he had never had this. Never a dinner shared with people who wanted him there not because they feared him, not because they needed something from him, but because they truly wanted him at the table. After the meal, when Jonah took Micah into the living room to play, Pearl looked at Ashton. Her eyes were still as sharp as knives, but they were no longer as cold as they had been the first time she blocked him at the door. "You're still dangerous," she said. "I still don't completely trust you." "I know," Ashton said with a nod. "But you've kept your word," Pearl continued. "You stayed." "I told you before," Ashton replied. "Don't listen to what I say. Watch what I do." Pearl was silent for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. For the first time, there was something in her eyes that came close to acceptance. Not full trust, not full forgiveness, but an acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as bad as she had once believed. This wasn't a fairy tale. 8 years couldn't be repaired in 6 months. Trust couldn't be rebuilt in a single season. There were still days when Rachel looked at Ashton and felt the old anger rise up inside her. There were still moments when Jonah wondered whether his father might disappear again. But they were trying. The little boy who had carried his baby brother through 15 freezing nights. The man who had forgotten how to feel. The woman who had learned that being strong didn't have to mean being alone. And the old woman who had taught all of them that family wasn't only blood, but presence. They weren't a perfect family. Maybe they never would be. But sometimes, all it takes is one small hand holding a photograph and standing still long enough for the right person to stop. Jonah hadn't known he was looking for his father that night. Ashton hadn't known he had a son. But fate has a strange way of bringing people together when they need each other most. And sometimes, trying is enough. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our best stories each week. How did this story make you feel? We'd truly love to hear what is in your heart in the comments below. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Wishing you and your loved ones good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.